Production support for InFocus is provided by Smithville, a locally owned business serving central and southern Indiana since 1922. With residential business internet, voice, and security services. Smithville, local pride, global technology. Information at smithville.net. The Herald Times featuring Hotline, every weekday where reporter Marcy Krebs answers your questions about local oddities and curiosities. Online at heraldtimes.com. Hoosier Energy, providing electricity for central and southern Indiana electric cooperatives and their member customers. Information at hepn.com. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
The National Conference of State Legislators estimates the collective budget gap for all 50 states will exceed $83 billion for the 2011 fiscal year. In an effort to ease Indiana's financial crisis, Governor Mitch Daniels ordered nearly $300 million in cuts from the state's public education budget earlier this year. To make up some of that lost cash, Monroe County schools will ask voters to approve higher taxes, and other school districts are considering consolidation. Tonight, we'll discuss how to find money for schools as we put education in focus. Thanks for joining us for this edition of In Focus. I'm Stan Jastrzebski. If you have questions for one of our studio experts during tonight's program, please do email us at infocus@indiana.edu or call us at 1-800-987-9848. Well, there are billions of dollars in the red, so school districts are examining their options this year. And WTIU's Shamika Neely reports that state officials are pondering the gap between what the state can afford and what it must provide.
In May, the state reported 16 school district proposed referendums. Of those, only half were approved by voters, despite the $26 billion in emergency funds pushed through in an effort to save educators from losing their jobs. Districts are still finding it difficult to sustain costs. Historically, school districts are used to doing more with less, but Indianapolis Public Schools Superintendent Eugene White says prioritizing their budgets has become more important than ever.
We've always attempted to work out situations. The educational budget situation in the state is at a serious crisis level. Now that the general fund is tied into state revenues, we are depending on a robust state economy in order to fund our largest operational fund.
And when those funding changes went into effect in 2008, no one predicted the recession or the effect it would have on Indiana and the nation.
We've drained the state surplus almost completely. It's going to be around the $100 million range at the end of this budget cycle. That's down from almost $2 billion. Plus, so we've spent all that money to keep the budget in the black. We've made these big cuts across the board. I don't see how you create a state budget that doesn't have a lot of pain for a lot of people. But there's just no more money. The money's gone.
With billions of dollars in educational deficits around the state, Plucker says officials are considering a number of cost-cutting options. One proposed solution is district consolidation. Plucker says that would mean bigger districts and smaller schools.
The research is a little thin, in part because a lot of the last major round of school consolidation was 50 or 60 years ago. But a few states have really tried consolidation, and they're really more case studies than anything else, so we have to be cautious. But what those case studies really tell us is that consolidation sounds great, it makes perfect sense, and doesn't really seem to have much of an impact in terms of cost savings or student achievement. In our analysis, we even think that a case can be made that some of the larger school districts in the state of Indiana should be deconsolidated.
It's a matter of priority. It takes a lot of vision, it takes a lot of planning, and it takes a commitment on the part of our elected politicians and our citizens who put them in place. But if we have the will to do it, we can get it done. We're going to have a greater strategy, and one of our problems in this state is that we do a lot of talking, but we don't put our money where our mouths are. What I mean by that is we expect students to get and be prepared for an education, but we don't prepare them for school.
To some experts, the budget gap is not a surprise, and Plucker thinks it's going to take will and a certain vote to get back in the black.
People should have seen it coming. I'm not going to play the blame game now. I really do hope that it passes. That massive property tax cut that we got created a huge structural deficit in the state budget, which no one really talks about now. It was widely discussed at the time. Decreasing property taxes by 50 to 60% or more in some places, and trying to replace that with a 1% sales tax. The numbers never added up.
As the November general election approaches, K-12 education is at the forefront for many educators and community members. Tonight, we put the state and future of education in focus.
And joining us on this evening's program, our former Indiana Superintendent of Public Instruction, Sue Ellen Reed, Indiana Association of School Business Officials Executive Director Dennis Casterison, and State Representative Terry Gooden of Crothersville, who's also the Superintendent of Crothersville Community Schools. Thanks to all of you for being here. And Representative Gooden, we'll start with you, since you've seen this from two different sides, from the legislature and from being a school superintendent. 2 years ago, of course, we moved, as you heard Eugene White say, from a property tax model to a sales tax model. Give me your view, both as a superintendent and as a representative, on how well that's worked in these 2 years.
Well, you know, Stan, really, no matter what taxing entity you use to fund your schools, you have to make education a priority. So whether you're using property taxes, whether you're using sales tax, if you commit a certain amount of dollars or a certain amount of resources to education, then it shouldn't really matter where that source comes from. But the problem is, as Dr. White said, that those politicians haven't put their money where the mouth is. And so what we have is the governor cutting schools. When school corporations were putting their budgets together, the governor was traveling around the state talking about Indiana being this island of prosperity amongst, in the middle of all these states of despair. Well, he kind of gave schools a false sense of security, telling them that we haven't cut education. Indiana has not cut education. Well, in the middle of their budget cycle then, these superintendents and school boards were adopting budgets. Then at the point after the budgets were already adopted and starting to be implemented, then the governor comes back and says, oh my goodness, we've got to cut schools now because we need the money. So it was almost it's almost a bait and switch on the governor's part. I don't mean to be critical, but I mean, he should have been realistic about what was going on in the state. He's basically he's the top fiscal officer of the state of Indiana as the governor when it comes to spending the dollars. And he has to be more realistic on what's going on. He should have gave us a clearer picture.
Some months ago, I was in actually your State House office, which you share with Sheila Klinker from Lafayette. And she herself is a former educator, and she said that she was hearing time and time again that property taxes are the most stable way to fund education. Let me go to you, Dr. Reed. As far as that goes, is that your experience, having been the top educator in the state for a number of years?
Well, I was also a superintendent, and before that a principal, and before that a teacher. And property tax is the most substantial. We can count on it from year to year. And the most important thing about all of this is that what we spend on education should not be considered an expense. It should be considered as an investment. And that investment in the future, it's incalculable how important that is to our state, to our country, and definitely to individual students. For example, if a student is a senior this year and doesn't have the teachers that he or she needs in order to get the kinds of things that he or she needs to know and be able to do. If you're a first grader this year and there are 35 kids in your class instead of 25, it's going to make a huge difference. And so we have to think about the continuity and how important it is to each child each day and the investment we make in their education.
If I can, I want to piggyback on something Dr. Reed said there. It seems as though the powers to be in the state of Indiana right now see our public education system as a liability instead of an asset. And you can't talk, I mean, on one hand, the group's going around talking about we need to create great jobs in Indiana. Well, I'm the first person to sit here and tell you that Our public schools are the #1 economic development tool of our state. You cannot talk about creating great jobs unless you have great schools. Those two go hand in hand. You can't separate those. That's not the story coming out of the State House at this point.
And Dennis, this all leads back to the fact that here in Monroe County especially, we've got a couple of different referenda that are on the ballot this year that both have differing effects on how they view the funding of education. And that gets us to the point where we're talking about Indiana, which historically has not been a referendum state, getting to be one when it comes to having to fund individual school districts here and there.
Absolutely. We have not been a referendum state as such. I mean, there were referendums clear back in 1973 when we had the Bowen tax package. That's where it started, but now we're really looking at those because, as we've talked here already, about the cuts that schools are getting. And I think people have to understand that where we're heading on this, as far as referendums, this is not really new money. This is money that they have lost. These are not for new programs. This is to keep what they have. This is status quo dollars, so that they don't have, as Dr. Reed said, 35 in a classroom, which again is unacceptable. So I think that absolutely we have went now to a referendum state, and I think you'll see more and more and more because on Tuesday there'll be 13 general fund referendums, 4 construction referendums that'll be going on coming up Tuesday, and be interested to see how they go.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about that actually.